Hello, and thank you for joining me in this distillation of the book, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor by Donald Robertson. We are going to be doing the specific distillation of the chapter called The Most Truthful Child in Rome. So this is a long one. Grab a drink right now, click a like and click subscribe, and let's get started. So in the previous chapter, we looked at how Marcus approached his death at the age of 58 due to sickness. But now we're going to rewind back to his early life and examine how you can speak wisely, especially to yourself, using the techniques shown in Stoicism. So Marcus had seen death early in life. His father died when he was 3, yet he had the good fortune of having a grandfather who was a senator. He was also consul 3 times, a friend of the Emperor Hadrian, and was brother-in-law to Hadrian's wife. So Marcus was already in Hadrian's orbit from a young age. Hadrian must have really liked what he saw in Marcus. So just to give an example, how we kind of know this is that he made Marcus a knight at age 6. He appointed him as a priest, and all they really kind of had to do was elaborate dances for the war god Mars at 8, but still a priest. And at age 16, he adopted him as a grandson, making him second in line to succeed him as emperor. He actually wanted Marcus to directly succeed him, but Hadrian thought he was too young, so he adopted Antonius Pius to succeed him on the condition that Marcus would in turn succeed Antonius. And in court, Hadrian gave Marcus the nickname Versemius, which means the most truthful, as Marcus tended to be plain-spoken and honest. Now, this differed from the popular rhetoricians of the Sophist school or Sophist school that were really kind of popular during this era. And you'll probably hear about the Sophists referred to as probably more or less the bad guys, at least in this early stage of the story here. What Sophists taught was some philosophy and some morality, but what they really wanted to do was be praised for their verbal agility and for what they knew. So I guess they knew all sorts of trivia and little things here and there. But in the end, they talked about virtues, but that was just only a veneer. They didn't act in accordance with the virtues. Problem is, we got Hadrian, who actually leaned into the traits of the Sophists rather than the Stoics in his own behavior. Still, he valued Marcus's plain-spokenness. I mean, maybe he had a soft spot for Stoics. Hadrian might have been on friendly terms with Epictetus, and Epictetus's student Arrian, who's absolutely brilliant. Both were from the Stoic school. Marcus was very influenced by Epictetus' discourses and Chiridon, where Epictetus contrasts how the Sophists and philosophers like those of the Stoic school use speech. And so, for example, philosophers are supposed to be humble, moral, and they seek to improve the audience. Like a therapist who wants to improve others through gaining virtue. Now, this isn't exactly the most popular thing to do, as it can be difficult to hear. In contrast, the Sophists or the rhetoricians sought praise and view rhetoric as entertaining. It's really easy on the ears. While in contrast, you're going to get a therapy session if you have a discussion in depth with a Stoic. So, and Epictetus even said explicitly, you should expect pain rather than pleasure if you go to the philosopher. So, while Sounds like these Stoics and philosophers might not be a blast of the party, but it may be something you want a good friend to tell you. And while we're examining Marcus's youth, let's look at Marcus's mother for some context in his upbringing. Marcus's mother, Domitilla Lucilla, could be pronouncing that wrong, like I'm pronouncing half the stuff in Italian or Latin wrong. She was wealthy, yet she had a simple, unostentatious way of life, and she really enjoyed Greek culture. Marcus took on some traits from his mother. He found court life a struggle with all the falseness of it all. He gave away many of his possessions during his life. For example, he gave his sister what he actually inherited from his own father. And in order to fund a war effort, when he was emperor, he auctioned off some imperial treasures rather than keep them for himself. He wrote simply, courtesy of the Stoic tutor his mother introduced him to, Junius Rusticus. And we'll hear more about him later. But even before learning Stoicism formally, he learned some lessons common to the Cynic and Stoic schools. He learned how to tolerate discomfort and others' criticisms, and how to avoid bad habits or being hurt by what others said easily. Now, to be able to endure and forbear problems of others was something that he learned to do early. Marcus credited a person that we really just don't know who he was with a great deal of influence upon his morality. That person showed him how to endure hardships, be self-reliant, and have little needs, ignore slander or be nosy, or even be concerned with which side won at chariot races, apparently a popular pastime. But it was his painting tutor, Diogenes, who introduced Marcus formally to Stoicism. He showed him how to stay away from popular forms of entertainment, like quail fighting or gambling. Apparently he already knew how to stay away from that chariot racing, and how to avoid being taken in by flim-flam artists or people who spoke of miracle cures, particularly those who could exorcise demons. And historical note, all these people who said they could exorcise demons were Christians. So, historical note there. Other things he taught were how to forbear hardship. So to learn to endure, what he would do is he would sleep on a pelt and a camp mat in the house. Eventually his mother kind of had enough of that and said, okay, you can use a couch instead. He may have trained in other forms of voluntary hardship that were popular with the Cynic and Stoic schools, though, like eating simple meals, taking cold baths, or swimming in the winter. I think taking cold baths is actually something that's kind of come into vogue recently, or cold showers. Maybe I'll give it a try and see how that works. He also wore a cloak with his shoulders exposed and with a beard, as was the fashion with philosophers back then. I guess that's kind of like how hipsters wear beards and shorts in the winter. His language, though, shifted towards those of the Stoics rather than the Sophists over time. The Sophists in Hadrian's time were at their peak, and Hadrian himself, as we said before, had some tendencies toward the Sophist school. Diogenes pushed Marcus towards writing dialogues as used in philosophy. So those dialogues, if you've ever read any of the Republic, Plato's Republic, or you're familiar with two characters arguing back and forth to demonstrate a philosophical point, that's a dialogue. If you read a play, it might very well be like that, just between two people. If you need to look at the format, it can be interesting. He also attended lectures by philosophers, including Apollonius of Chalcedon, who would later become one of the tutors that he admired. Apollonius would walk the talk of philosophy. And through his tutors, most likely Diogenes, he was exposed to Epictetus, whom we know is a huge influence on him. Now let's go back to the Imperial Court. He wasn't enthused about court life, and his mother particularly wasn't either. He didn't like the sniveling and corruption, and Hadrian did not help things. He followed that Stoic model where he ridiculed his opponents, and then worse yet, over time he increasingly had them executed. That's one way to get rid of your opponents. And he was just becoming Nixonian in gathering intelligence, even on his friends. And just note that Marcus did not praise Hadrian at all in his meditations. I don't even know if he really even mentioned them, quite frankly. However, that could not be said for his predecessor, Marcus's predecessor, that is, Antonius, who was bestowed with the honorific Pius. He was conciliatory, calm, didn't have much of the imperial regalia around him, nor did he respond with a barb against his opponents. Marcus found him to be an ideal Stoic, and Antonius didn't rush to judgment impetuously. He listened to what people had to say first. He wasn't vain. He didn't seek out approval. So the court gradually came under influence of the Stoics through the seemingly natural behavior of Antonius, natural Stoic behavior of Antonius, and the more studied Stoicism of Marcus. Still, Marcus as a youth would have had to study rhetoric, as that was de rigueur for a nobleman. His main tutor was someone named Fronto, who actually thought Marcus was already a skilled speaker before Marcus turned 15, but he didn't want Marcus to continue following these Stoics due to their straightforward talk rather than speaking like a cosmopolitan emperor. Also, the Stoics tended to dress down, rather than wear the imperial purple robes. In any case, once Antonius became emperor, Marcus's full-time tutor became the gentleman we discussed before, Apollonius of Chalcedon, who showed through his own example how to live in accord with virtues like wisdom and how to use reason as a basis for guiding life. Apollonius would have been a good example of what Marcus would later have to face, which, as we've seen from the first chapter, was illness, the eventual death of children, and pain. He accepted favors without showing ingratitude or lowering himself. He showed Marcus the relationship between love of wisdom and being emotionally resilient, using a type of therapy that yielded liberty from potentially harmful desires or passion. So let's talk about the stages in response to an event that arises and how a Stoic might respond to that. So there's a story about a Stoic sage who's caught in a terrible storm. For the record, the sage is neither Seneca or Zeno, and he's in that boat where Aulus Gellius, who was the author of the Attic Nights, he noticed that the sage had the same terrified expression as anyone else. There's a storm, and the sage is like, ah! When Gellius asked why the sage had that terrified expression, the sage said that people facing danger naturally have a brief stage of fear, that is natural to have. And he showed Gellius a copy of the lost to us, not lost to him, lost fifth book of Epictetus's discourses to back up his claim. So Epictetus said that we have two phases in response to such an event. The first is our own initial responses formed naturally by an event. So like the storm comes and you're like, oh, right? You're going to be scared. And we don't have any control over those arise. So yeah, we're going to be a little bit frightened when there's a storm and on the boat and it's rocking and rolling. Animals might have a similar response, but that response dissipates once that stimulus goes away. Problem is, humans have a much superior capacity for thought, and then we can ruminate all night long about that stimulus, even though that stimulus has disappeared. That's a problem that arises. Then there's a second stage where, if we're wise, we don't have to follow that initial emotional reaction set forth in the first stage. Epictetus said to view the initial reactions and thoughts with a shrug, as they could lead you astray. You should just be indifferent to it and instead choose to handle it using your own reason. So now Seneca refined this with a three-stage model for what he called a passion. So I'm going to add another stage to it. Stage 0 is you receive a stimulus, and that can mean an event or something. And that's just for you phenomenology lunatics out there. This one is just for you, stage 0. Stage 1, though, are the initial impressions that are formed in your mind from that stimulus. Those are the proto-passions, kind of like Epictetus's first stage. The next stage, stage 2, this can kind of go one or two ways, right? So option 1, you follow that initial impression and add some sort of value judgment upon it, and then you intentionally dwell on it. Or option 2, step back and consider that is just an impression and not all the things you claim to represent, or that it's not the things that upset us, but our judgment about them. So it's all, more or less, he's saying, this is all in your head. That's what it gets back. You hold back from yielding to the thoughts and judgments arising from stage 1. So step back. Then you have stage 3. So if you yielded to those thoughts and judgments in stage 1, you might reach the point where you have a full-on passion. So that's like when Seneca experienced on a ship where he threw himself overboard during a storm rather than remain in the boat when he was sick. I'm not sure what's going on with all these Stoics and boats, but lots of stuff seems to happen to Stoics on ships. So the lesson you should learn from this, and very important, is if you ever see a Stoic going on a ship, don't follow them because it's going to be a bumpy ride. Just, stay away. Stoics and ships, it's going to get capsized. You're going to start a philosophical school. You're going to throw yourself overboard. Who knows what's going to happen? Anyhow, what you have to do is reevaluate your initial impressions. Your initial impression about something might very well be useless or misleading, and it could lead you down a path of continuing to worry and bring about anxiety. So while you might be in a bad situation like a storm, you don't want to make that situation worse by continuing down that thought trail that a calamity is sure to follow. That's called catastrophizing. And that's what Seneca did when he hurled himself from the ship in the storm. So the Stoic does experience fear as well as other emotions, but to have courage, he must at least have these first sensations of fear to endure. So that's a quote. One other thing is, it's important not to judge those initial or automatic feelings that arise immediately after you sense an event. So those arise naturally, and the Stoic should just view that with indifference. It's neither good or bad. Question is, how do we respond to those feelings? So we also do the same thing in Zen during Zazen. Those thoughts arise during Zazen, and we treat them indifferently. It's like we notice them and then let them pass. It's just that Zazen is practice for what we encounter in real life. And those who practice mindfulness, they also do something similar. So kind of interesting to see this interrelation here. Let's talk about Stoic plain speaking. So Marcus did not fall in with the sophist rhetorical clique when he was young, or pay much attention to logic or philosophy, all this. Rather, he really kind of glommed onto the application of ethics. Junius Rusticus urged him to use a more down-to-earth rhetorical style, rather than base his speech upon poetic or theoretical discussions, or, what would be worst of all would just be playing the role of a virtuous person like a sophist would. So, while Marcus was initially receptive to that sophist point of view advanced by his rhetoric tutor Fronto, he really grew into that model presented by Junius Rusticus instead. So, how does the Stoic speak if it's not in that eloquent way of the sophists? So Marcus would say that the shortest route is the best route, and that honest, simple language that should be concise and objective would be the route to go. It shouldn't trigger strong emotions, for those could be undergirded by some strong value judgments. Keep in mind that speaking out loud is just one small part of the battle. It's also what we say to ourselves in our mind that will make you lose or win this war. That is the most important part of discourse. So we speak to ourselves and influence ourselves with the language we use in our own head. For example, we, or Seneca, could say to ourselves while our ship is in a storm, "Oh man, this is horrible. The ship is going to crash." Now, this catastrophizing language isn't going to help. It's in your head and you have to swim around there. Not going to help. Or when we're looking for a job, if we say to ourselves, "I'm not qualified. Surely there's thousands of people way more qualified for me than this job. So what's the point of even sending out my resume?" So this is all just internal jibber jabber that isn't going to lead you down the road to applying for a job when it could very well be that this is exactly the right job for you. You're just not even going to try it because you engage into that self-talk. So Stoics use reason to win their arguments and to convey the truth. The philosophers, after all, want to grasp reality and to show others this reality. Exaggerations or biased language and omissions, those are all fair use by the sophists. And I'm sure you have a friend or know someone, maybe a politician from the sophist school. They might be overly florid in describing a situation, especially if they think that they are always right or that someone else is always to blame. For a Stoic ideal, in terms of a communicator, it might be a traditional journalist rather than kind of what we see today. There would be an emphasis just on the facts, not on opinions or colorful language or the use of $10 words. The Stoic isn't out to win a Pulitzer for poetry, though they'd certainly like to win the debate, for sure. They're used to language strips something down to their essence rather than florid or opinionated descriptions. We're trying to get to reality, not something that's full of rhetorical embellishment. Nor would the Stoics describe something as good or bad, or would they place a judgment on something in their mind. For example, say someone lost their job in a layoff. They might think, "Oh, why did this happen to me after all the years I worked there? And that idiot Jim, he still has his job." A Stoic instead would just say, "I was laid off." So, in the words of Joe Friday from Dragnet, just the facts, man. Stoics use language in a fact-based way in order to get a grip on reality. Now, the philosophical term Robertson prefers is objective representation. Personally, I'm biased towards get a grip, since that's what I tell my family members or my dog when they're going off the rails It often happens when you have teens in a house, as well as my dog when she starts barking at an imaginary object, a squirrel, or someone just walking across the street. Using objective representation with language is one way to help prevent us from getting carried away with our passions or eventually catastrophizing about a situation. We need to see and describe ourselves in that reality. Grasping reality is also one of the goals of Buddhism, at least then, as well as Taoism. And cognitive behavioral therapists use a technique with their clients where they would describe something in down-to-earth, simple language, just like a Stoic would, in order to decatastrophize something so it's less likely to provoke anxiety. We avoid exaggerating or using hyperbolic language with this technique. So one tactic is to change a question posed from, a challenging situation from a what if game to the so what game. For example, you can imagine that laid off person engages in that what if game, like, oh, what if this happened? And then they run through an elaborate scenario in their mind where they were eventually penniless, and then they're begging for money, and they're sleeping under a bridge, and all their friends would think of their failure, et cetera, et cetera. So that is totally classic catastrophizing, right? Instead, if they play the so what game, they ask themselves, so what if the situation arises? So what if I'm laid off? Is this as bad as I think? Therapists also ask clients, what next, when describing what could happen in this scenario. These situations and things that happen, they change over time. Reality is you're not stuck in one phase. So clients might be totally fixated on the worst phase of something, and they don't look at other stages. Certainly I've done that. Like, people are going to think I'm a failure. I'm not going to have any money. Might not look at other stages. Like, if you get laid off, they're not looking at, like, this is an opportunity for you to now pursue maybe a dream job, for example. So they might need, a gentle push, I would say, like, what's likely next? And next, what can you do next? There's also a model of how stress arises called the transactional model, where you have an equation where there's two sides. One side of the equation is how bad does someone view a situation, and on the other hand is how well does someone think that they can handle or cope with that situation. So when that equation becomes out of balance and they don't think they can handle, cope with the situation, and this is, getting all out of whack, people just start feeling stressed out. But it turns out there are some strategies for relieving the cause of that stress and equipping yourselves with techniques for coping with this. So the Stoics ask themselves, what attributes or virtues that they love to use do they have that can assist them in the situation? They also can write letters of consolation to others when they're faced with a difficult situation, and they also write, though, letters of consolation to themselves when they're faced with a difficult situation. That can put you outside your own situation and allow you to more easily decatastrophize it. So just try writing a problem that's upsetting to you and describe it in plain language, not florid language, not using all sorts of adjectives and adverbs, just straight describing, and give some examples, if you can, of how something positive could come from it if you encounter that situation. Also, you could try seeking out models of people who you admire and ask yourself, what would they do? So like Marcus would say, hey, what would Antonius Pius do in this situation? So these strategies help give you some separation from the situation itself, and trying to look at what the reality of the situation actually it is. So what this is called cognitive distancing. What this gets to is that your thinking about a situation is not reality. Let's repeat that again. Your thinking about a situation is not reality. Epictetus had a saying about this. It's not things that upset us, but our judgments about things. Whether we look at reality and think it's just the shadows on the wall, like Plato's Parables of the Cave, or whether it's because we have glasses on that are colored blue, yellow, or red, the beliefs and values that we have about the world change how we view the world. And it can feel like our own thoughts and feelings actually create the reality for us, rather than what is the reality. So what we're getting to here is just, let's break out of the matrix, folks. So Donaldson also gives some more examples of cognitive distancing strategies that can be used from CBT. So those might be like writing your thoughts out as if you were someone else. For example, I might write out, Kier is thinking about how his book will be received, or writing the pros and cons of an opinion. Stoicism has some cognitive distancing techniques as well. We've already talked a little bit about them. So one is just talking to your thoughts, and this is called apostrophizing, not catastrophizing. It's apostrophizing. It's a new term for me. Who are feeling and saying it. It's not the thing it represents. So I think it kind of gets back to what Epictetus says. It's not things that upset us, but our judgments about things. So getting back to those thoughts, right? And saying that it is not the thing it represents. Your thoughts and feelings are not reality. There's a really good technique. I can't recommend this enough, right? It's called the Stoic Fork from the Enchiridion, that tells us to remind ourselves that some things are out of our control, and it makes no sense to either seek it out or go out of our way to try to avoid it. So when something is out of your control, it makes absolutely no sense that you have to act to do something when you don't have control over something. For example, Seneca could not control the weather, but he could have controlled himself from jumping off the boat. Instead, he should have viewed the weather as being out of his control and be indifferent to it, rather than continue down the train that he did from his initial reaction. After all, what in the world could he do about the weather, right? What happens after I do a job interview isn't really up to me. I can certainly do a follow-up phone call, but really it's up to the company's HR whether I get that job or not. I'm not at fault if I don't get the job. And I'm also not an awesome person if I do get that position. It's not up to me. I'm not in control, so I should just be indifferent. So take a breather, right? Personally, I find that the Stoic Fork is a really, really powerful technique. Sometimes it's easier said than done, but here's an example from my own life. Like when I had an early cancer diagnosis, yay, that strategy prevented me from going down a real bad path of worry that, you could probably imagine anyone who gets that might do. So it's like, we start doom scrolling. Let's look up a WebMD and let's talk to all sorts of other people and make them worry. All right, you get the cancer. Fretting over it's not going to do anything. Do what you need to do, and that's it. Socrates was a real master of the Stoic Fork. Many people, I think practically all, including myself, would be absolutely terrified of death. But Socrates wasn't afraid of it. He just wanted to meet his demise with virtue and wisdom. The Athenians sentenced him to death, and I don't exactly know why. I haven't read the the rationale behind that. He wanted to meet his demise with virtue and wisdom. So let's sum all this up. Whether something is good or bad really stems from how we think about it and the values we ascribe to it. Our opinions and our thoughts about things are not the things themselves. They are not reality. A Stoic uses plain language both externally, but especially in his own thoughts or her thoughts, let's be inclusive, to describe a situation accurately without any sort of judgment. So this is what we have to do in order to purify the mind, according to Marcus. So I know I've said a lot there. Thank you so much for listening. Please leave some comments. Please subscribe, click like. Hopefully I can get on this path that I'm going on through the next chapter, but it does take a little bit of work to get these chapters up. I know I'm a little bit behind schedule. I'm doing my best. But thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you again soon on Sloppy Zen. Have a good one.
See, we got ourselves a little conundrum right here. What is this? Fluffer stuffing. Goodbye, fluffer stuffing. Look at them eyebrows. Yes, sir. That's why when you come to our steakhouse, you get 5 pounds of prime rib, a porterhouse, and a 10-pound hamburger. And all the fixings for the low, low price of $150.